Star Wars Jedi Survivor is finally here, Cal Kestis is back, and so too are the many people, monsters, and droids who want him dead. Even with a variety of difficulties, Jedi Survivor is not an easy game, with deep combat that requires a little more finesse than just wildly swinging around your lightsaber, hoping that enemies fall before you do. Fortunately, we've got 11 essential combat tips to help give you a leg up and make your enemies truly fear the power of a Jedi Master. If you take nothing else away from this video, remember this. The number one most important thing to note about the combat in Jedi Survivor is that with every lightsaber stance but one, when you press the attack button, you are stuck in that attack animation until it's done. There's no changing your mind and thinking, oh dang, actually you know what, I meant to block. Every swing of your lightsaber needs to be calculated, and you are strongly discouraged from just mindlessly mashing the attack button. This is why it's good to get into the habit of only pressing the attack button once or twice at a time, unless the enemy's block meter is drained. Enemies in Jedi Survivor have a habit of punishing you if you get overly aggressive by armoring through your attacks to deal one of their own. That said, if this style of combat doesn't suit you and you want to go wild and crazy just pressing buttons when you shouldn't be pressing buttons, well then allow me to introduce you to the dual saber stance. This is the only stance in the game where you can cancel the startup animation of attack by pressing the block button to go right into a defensive stance. The trade-off here though is that you take more damage and the individual attacks aren't as strong as the other stances. You'll also want to be careful of unblockable attacks because while your animations are block cancelable, they are not dodge cancelable. So if you see an enemy flashing red when you're mid-attack, you'll need to first block, then dodge to get out of the way. Cal's lightsaber skills are formidable, but the true equalizer is his force abilities, so make sure not to neglect them. Always look for opportunities to end fights early by pushing enemies off a ledge, pulling weaker enemies towards you and then throwing them at others, tossing roller mines at groups, and pushing missiles back at B2 droids. Many enemies are resistant to your force powers, but that doesn't mean that they're not still helpful. While staff-wielding purge troopers may try to slash you on the way in when you try to force pull them, you can actually use that to your advantage by parrying that predictable attack, dealing big damage to their block meter. Once you gain the ability to force pull larger enemies, pulling in DT droids is a great way to take them off their feet and get in some free hits. Pushing these large beasts when they attack you will allow you to knock them over and follow up with some big damage. And you can use the area pull ability to bundle weaker enemies together so you can take them all out at once with some twin blade lightsaber dancing. Jedi Survivor's combat is very similar not just to the previous game, but also to Sekiro. And if there's one thing to know about this style of combat, it's that parrying is not a suggestion, it's an essential part of the game. To parry, you need to block shortly before an attack lands. Fortunately, the timing window for parries, even on Jedi Master difficulty level, is pretty forgiving, so definitely err on the side of being too early as opposed to trying to carefully time it right before an enemy attack lands. Just because you parried an attack doesn't necessarily mean that it's now your turn to strike. Most of the tougher enemies in Jedi Survivor won't just give up on their attack after you've parried them once, or even twice. You'll need to parry them several times before they give you an opportunity to counter. And many will even throw unblockables into their combos to really mess you up. So make sure you're really focusing on remembering enemy attack patterns, recognizing which attacks have follow-ups when they're parried, and keep an eye out on their block meter, because once you deplete their meter by parrying, they won't be able to counterattack. Speaking of the block meter, much like in the first game, combat in Jedi Survivor is governed by a block meter, both for you and for your enemies. Holding block will avoid all damage, with the exception of red unblockable attacks, but every attack you block will deplete your block meter. And once it's empty, you will be staggered for a short time and vulnerable to attacks until your meter automatically refills. However, if you parry an attack, you won't lose any of your meter. In fact, as mentioned in the previous point, you'll actually deal substantial damage to your opponent's block meter. For some enemies, like the KX security droids, it can actually be easier to deal with them by focusing on parrying their 2 melee punches, which will instantly deplete their block meter, giving you an opportunity to get in free hits without worrying about retaliation. One trick that Cal must have learned from playing some fighting games is that he can use what's known as a Nukemi to quickly get up off the ground after getting knocked down by pressing the dodge button. This is a very valuable skill to know because Cal can still be hit even when on the ground. So it's important to get back up on your feet as quickly as you can and be ready to deal with whatever threats you have to. Cal is a supremely powerful Jedi Knight and can kill most enemies and creatures with one hit, but that doesn't mean that they don't still pose a threat. When faced with an enemy encounter with lots of B1 droids or stormtroopers mixed in with B2s, purge troopers, or other tougher enemies, make sure that you're focusing on taking out the weaker ones first so you don't find yourself constantly getting peppered by blaster shots, headbutted by gorgers, or hit by rockets or grenades from off screen. One of the great things about dying against the boss is that you drop a forced restoration point on the ground when you die. This is a classic Souls-like trope where you can collect it to regain your skill point progress. But it also has another, even more useful function. It completely restores your health and force. Use this to your advantage by picking it up when you need to replenish your life and don't want to waste a stim. New to Jedi Survivor is a super move that Cal can use to slow everything down around him. The main function of this should be as a get out of jail free card. Activate it when you're in a tough spot or are swarmed by enemies, as you are completely invulnerable during the activation. And you can use that short period of invulnerability to put yourself in a better position, heal up, and deal some damage before the slow ends. Note that once you start attacking enemies, they can still hurt you even while the super is active. Choose whatever stances you feel like you gel with the most, but also be aware of the strengths and weaknesses of each stance. Just to reiterate, you take more damage while in the dual saber stance. This might not seem like much, but it adds up. Likewise, if you're using the crossguard stance, you need to change up your game plan to be much more deliberate, making sure that you're picking your spots to attack carefully, because it's very easy to get interrupted and stifled during your slow but powerful swings. If you're faced with a crowd of enemies, or there's a Gatling gun stormtrooper off in the distance, it's a good time to switch to your double-bladed stance, which is excellent at dealing with those situations. Every stance is viable, but some are better suited to certain situations and boss fights than others. On that note, if you're stuck on a boss or a tough combat encounter, don't be afraid to mix it up by switching to a new stance, even if you haven't put any skill points into it. The skills are helpful, sure, but each stance's damage is fixed. So even if you haven't put a single point into the crossguard stance, it will still do the same damage as that stance at max level. And finally, let's talk about dodging. If you just tap a direction and press dodge, Cal will do a quick evasive dash in that direction with some invulnerability frames in the middle of the dash. You see how Cal is a bit blurry during the dash? That means he's invulnerable during that time. If you double tap the dodge button, Cal will do an extra little hop, which is not invulnerable, but is still super useful to get Cal out of a bad spot. If you stand still and press the dodge button right before an attack lands, you'll do a precision evade, which will not only let you recover really quickly to land some strikes of your own, but will also restore a small amount of force. And lastly, if you purchase the focus sight skill, you can hold down the B button to automatically evade all non-unblockable melee attacks, which is helpful, but also takes a tremendous amount of force. And those are 11 essential combat tips to help you get through Star Wars Jedi Survivor. It's not an easy game, but hopefully these tips will help you go from Padawan to Jedi Grand Master. Thanks for watching, and for more Star Wars Jedi Survivor, make sure to check out our review, along with the first minutes of the game. And for everything else, keep it here on IGN.